Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to Biographical Portraits as a World History Lens. This is the second installment of Primary Sources Fall webinar series for world history teachers and other curious folks. Tonight, we'll be on the road with one of history's great adventurers, Ibn Battuta, the 14th century Muslim writer, explorer, scholar, and cosmopolitan man. And we are so delighted to have as our presenter this evening the scholar who's done more than any other, I think it's fair to say, to make Ibn Battuta known to Western audiences and to many, many students, and that is Professor Ross Dunn. So hello, Professor Dunn, and welcome to Primary Source.
Hello, Susan, and hello to everyone.
It's great to have you here. Thank you so much. We're really excited to be learning from you tonight. I'm Susan Zeiger. I'm a program director at Primary Source. I'll be introducing Ross more formally in just a few moments, but let me say a few things first. This webinar this evening is one of a three-part series this fall analyzing diverse figures in world history from about 1200 to 1600 CE. And we were drawn to this topic for several reasons. One is the trend toward using a wide variety of nonfiction texts in the social studies classroom, something that we are very excited about at Primary Source and we have been working on for some time. We think about biography and personal narratives, autobiographies, memoirs of different forms as powerful ways to bring the distant past to life for our students. So that's the series, and we've invited three renowned world historians and biographers this fall to help us explore what a single eventful life can tell us about deep and broad themes in the making of the global world. This, of course, includes many of the core themes of AP World History, which I know many of you teach, such as the interchange and interaction of cultures and the development of ruling systems and empires in exchange with one another, which we'll be touching upon this evening. I should add as well that all three of our scholars that we invited to work with us this semester are deeply involved in world history education and really excited to work with an online community of teachers who share their passion for global history. So this seminar tonight, as I said, is the second in our series. We premiered 3 weeks ago with Professor Morris Rasabi presenting on the Mongols in global history through the lens of gender history, which was a fascinating discussion. And we close out the series on December 5th with Professor Mary Wiesner-Hanks of the University of Wisconsin comparing the life stories and leadership of Elizabeth, Queen of England, and Queen Aminatu, contemporary Elizabeth, and an early ruler of a West African kingdom. If you missed any of these sessions, you'll be able to find each of them as a recording after about a week after they broadcast live on our YouTube channel. Primary Source has a YouTube channel where we have a large and growing collection of scholar and teacher presentations on world history and global studies, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that later tonight. As soon as the recording from this session tonight is ready, we'll email you the link, and also you should know that all of the sources and references that we mentioned tonight can be found in the slides. I also now want to welcome all of you who are joining us from different parts of the country and beyond, and thank you so much for making the time in your busy lives and careers to be with us this evening. Later in the hour tonight, we'll have a designated block of time for your questions and comments. But I do encourage you to begin entering whatever thoughts or questions occur to you as soon as they do. We'll keep watching the screen for those, the chat box, and you can use the lower left chat box of your computer screen to type in your questions, and then just remember to push enter after you type, and your comment will post for all of us to see. We'd really love to know what drew you to the webinar this evening and what classroom connections or curriculum elements you're excited to make with this material. toward the end of our evening, we'll also share some high-quality classroom resources that Primary Source has curated in conjunction with this session. That's my reminder to say one more thing. Professional development hours are available for those who have signed up to take part in all 3 webinar sessions. We've been communicating with you about that procedures and requirements, which we've tried to keep to a bare minimum. But if you have any questions at all or you haven't seen those emails, please write me at susan@primarysource.org, and I will be really glad to fill you in on that process. Now a word about our organization. Primary Source is a nonprofit organization that partners with educators to bring global and cultural awareness into K-12 classrooms and schools and advance global education. We are now almost 30 years old. The heart of our work is professional development that's carried out in many different formats, face-to-face, online courses, study tours, and book discussion groups. We're also an online resource center for global education. We do curriculum development and school consulting as well. We welcome you to join us and learn more about our work. I'll close us out this evening by sharing some easy ways to do that. And now I'd like to turn our attention to the purpose for which we gathered this evening, and that is to hear about Ibn Battuta, why we know what we know about his remarkable life, also to think about cross-cultural exchange in the diverse Islamic civilizations of the 14th century, and to explore the concept of cosmopolitanism, which is of real interest, as you'll see, to Professor Dunn. And to do those things, we turn to our distinguished presenter, Dunn, for this evening. There was a lot to say, and I could only fit a few things on this small slide, but Professor Dunn is a Professor Emeritus of History at San Diego State University, where he taught African, Islamic, and world history for many decades. He is currently now an Associate Director of the National Center for History in the Schools at UCLA, an organization that many of you are familiar with and that we very much admire here at Primary Source. His publications are many, and they include The Adventures of Ibn Battuta, a Muslim traveler of the 14th century, and very recently, Panorama, a World History, a project to create a new style of textbook for world history courses that Ross is very excited about, and I hope he'll get a chance to say a few words about that later tonight, too. Ross entered the graduate program in Comparative World History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he specialized in African and Islamic history. Following field work in France and North Africa, he wrote a dissertation that became his first book called Resistance in the Desert, Moroccan Responses to French Imperialism. He began his work on Ibn Battuta back in the 1970s, and his book, mentioned above and seen on the screen, appeared in 1987. It's now in its 3rd edition and has been translated into multiple languages. Ross has had an eventful life of adventures in the historical profession, I would say. In the early 1980s, he joined a group, put together a group of college and K-12 teachers to become a founder of the World History Association and was its first president. He remains an active participant, a passionate, active participant in that organization. In the 90s, he joined a team of educators who attempted to write national standards for history. And subsequently, it was a long story, but it became a controversial and fascinating incident in our history as a country, and he wrote History on Trial, Culture Wars, and the Teaching of the Past, a really interesting book in the late 90s about the standards debate and public controversy over history education in the United States. Most recently, Ross initiated a remarkable project in 2001 called World History for Us All, which is a web-based model curriculum for world history in the middle schools and high schools. And I do urge you to take a look at that incredible resource when you get a chance. So enough said. Ross, we are really looking forward to hearing your presentation this evening on Ibn Battuta. Would you like to make sure that we can hear you? Say hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you are perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you.
As the commercial says.
We can. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Ross, and we'll look forward to hearing your remarks, and we'll be back on after for our question and answer period. Take it away.
Good.
There's the first.
Before I start, I want to thank you, Susan, and all your staff at Primary Source for inviting me to take part in this series. I appreciate it very much.
You're most welcome.
And I'm always happy to talk about Ibn Battuta. Morris Rosabi, who spoke a couple of weeks ago in the series, talked about the Mongols, and he started out by destroying a number of myths about the Mongols. I'd like to start by destroying just one myth. I'm sure many of you have heard it. This is the idea that Islam experienced a golden age of great creativity and expansiveness between about the 8th and 11th centuries. But after that, it went into decline, just as Europe or Western civilization was surging ahead. I think that's a pretty silly myth because, in fact, from the 11th century to the 16th century, Islam was in a continual state of expansion into Africa and Asia and even parts of Europe. The 14th century was a particularly expansive period, and this is the century in which Ibn Battuta lived and traveled, and it was a pretty good time to travel during that period. I put the clicker on, Susan, and now I can't click ahead, so I got a clear page. There we go. That should work.
Okay. You want to go to the next slide now?
There we go.
Okay.
It's okay now. I'm sure many of you know something about Ibn Battuta because he's become quite well known in American society, probably more among school kids than anybody else because he's appearing now in so many of the textbooks. Ibn Battuta had a long full name, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Muhammad ibn Ibrahim ibn Yusuf al-Luwati at-Tangier, known as Ibn Battuta. I give you the full name because at the bottom line of his name you see al-Luwati, which means that he had ancestry from a large Berber confederation known as the Luwata. So he had this Berber ancestry, whereas we tend to think of him as an Arab because he was an Arabic-speaking urban Muslim gentleman. And he was born and raised in Tangier, thus Tangi refers to that. I'm having trouble advancing the slides. So there we go. There's some kind of a delay. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. How do we know anything about this travel narrative, which appeared in the middle of the 14th century? After Ibn Battuta passed away in 1368 or 1369, the manuscript circulated in North Africa and at least as far east as Egypt. We know that. The manuscript and probably various pieces of it, rather than the whole thing. But in the 1850s, two Roman Catholic priests who were working in Algeria found two copies of the complete manuscript in that country, which was then ruled by France. They brought the manuscript back to Paris. They prepared a printed edition of it and then translated it into French. And in the picture on the right, you see the edition they produced, which has the Arabic on the top of the page and the French on the bottom. After that, translations began to appear in lots of languages, including, of course, English, although the publication of the full English translation took a long time, 65 years, to be completed. The narrative has a really long, fancy name that I can never remember myself, but it's generally known as the Rihla, which means simply a book of travels. There we go. Well, why did I write a book about Ibn Battuta? I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin studying African and Islamic history. And when you do that, you learn about Ibn Battuta right away. You can't have a curriculum without him in it. But I got the idea of teaching world history after I started at San Diego State University. And it was world history teaching rather than Africa or Islamic history that got me interested in this idea. And it's because in my world history course, I put a lot of emphasis on interconnections among societies. And Ibn Battuta's travels really represent a marvelous example of the hemispheric connections, that is, connections that ran all the way across what I call Afro-Eurasia, meaning Europe, Asia, and Africa together, all the way from Morocco and Ireland to China and Japan. So my aim was to set those travels in a very broad historical context of Afro-Eurasia as a whole. From publication, from my idea to publication, the book took me about 10 years. I had a nice grant from a source in the 1980s, and that allowed me to take my young family to the University of Cambridge in England, and you can imagine me holed up in this library for long, long days working on this book. And the third edition of the book, my book, is pictured over there on the right. As I said, Ibn Battuta came from Tangier, and here we have a view of the old part of the city. We don't know where his house was, but it was up there on that hill somewhere. Tangier was not a very big city, but it was kind of an important seaport, and it was visited by various sorts of foreigners, particularly Catalans and Genoese and Venetians who came there to trade. So he would have seen these foreign peoples. He came from a family of legal scholars or jurists or lawyers, if you will, as well as judges, and he was brought up to pursue a career in that field, which he did. But he really couldn't get as much from Tangier out of it as he might have liked. He had to go to some more important places where the great universities of the Muslim world were to be found. So he decided to take off from Tangier and didn't come back, at least permanently, for 29 years. Here's a map of his travels. You can see their full extent. And this is rather stylized and simplified. They were really quite a bit more complicated than that in terms of regional or local areas. So the first motivation among, I think, 5 that I'll mention for traveling was to make the holy pilgrimage to the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. And I'm sure you all know that Muslims are under obligation, if they can do it, to make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. So Ibn Battuta heading out to go all the way across Africa to do that wasn't a particularly unusual thing, although maybe he was a bit young for it. But anyway, he started out to make the Hajj. And if you look at this map, you see Mecca there in the center. And if you notice carefully, it looks as though his roots converge on Mecca. And in other words, Mecca was a sort of hub for his travels. He was most of the time either going away from Mecca or coming back to Mecca, and he made the Hajj at least 5 times, maybe even more, that we don't know about. Secondly, he traveled to advance his education and associate with other scholars. Here we see a group of them gathered in a library. Now, the issue here is that even though that was his plan, apparently, and he spent some time studying in Damascus in Syria, he seemed to be much more interested in traveling than in hitting the books, which he really didn't do all that much. He never did become a great legal scholar. He just couldn't get the hang of doing so much studying, apparently. He did some, but not that much. He was ready to get on the road. But nevertheless, he was a member of the learned class, they call the ulama in Arabic, the learned class, and he gained membership in that class just by the way he talked, the kind of clothes he wore, his ability to recite and passages from the Quran and other important books. So he certainly came across as an educated gentleman. And during the travels, he often stayed in the great centers of learning in the Muslim world that are called madrasas. Now, you know, madrasas has gotten kind of a bad name recently as the place where, you know, Islamist crazies try to train little boys to be crazies too. But historically, madrasa means something more than that. It means simply a center of higher learning. One on the left is one of the great colleges in Fez. One on the right, it's actually the building on the left with the big dome. That's one of the great colleges in Cairo. I couldn't help also adding this picture down in the right-hand corner of Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, England. And you say, well, what does that have to do with Islam? Well, it doesn't have anything to do with it except that the creating of the college system in Europe, and very notably in Oxford and Cambridge, owed quite a debt to the Muslim model of how to organize an educational institution. That is, around the idea of teachers and students living together in a certain place and studying and working together. But also, the three colleges that you see here were all built just about the same time, the middle of the 14th century. Thirdly, he traveled to associate with Sufi devotees and holy people. Sufism was becoming very popular in North Africa when he was growing up, and he became very interested in it and wanted to engage in Sufi practice. Now, some people define Sufism as a kind of sect within Islam, but it really isn't that at all. I refer to it as the mystical dimension of Muslim belief and practice. And Christianity and Judaism both have mystical dimensions in their practice as well. It's the idea of the individual's search for closeness to God, for understanding God, for knowing God, for just simply even achieving oneness with God. And Sufis practice this in a number of ways, including, you see on the right, some Sufis in India who are dancing around and trying to build themselves up into an ecstatic state where they will feel God's presence. Over on the left, the Sufi lodge here is in Cairo, and Ibn Battuta describes this very building which is standing today. Fourthly, Ibn Battuta traveled to seek prestigious employment. Now, the idea here is that Islam was in this expansive mode. There were many areas where Islam was being established and just had been in the past maybe even century or two. And the rulers of those newly founded Muslim states wanted to be good Muslims, and so they wanted right away to attract and surround themselves with educated Muslims who would provide them with teachers, Quranic reciters, lawyers, judges, because they wanted to practice the holy law or the Sharia, calligraphers, poets, architects, all sorts of people who were getting hired, let's say, in the further frontiers of the Muslim world, including northern India. Ibn Battuta heard jobs were going down in India, and so he took off for there. It took him a long time to get there, but he finally did. And here we see him meeting for the first time the Sultan of Delhi, which was a very important state in the 14th century. And he certainly visited the mosque and saw the minaret on the left in Delhi, which are still standing today. The Sultan of Delhi gave him a job right away as a judge. And he held that position for a number of years, and then he got another position running a charity. And then finally, the Sultan appointed him to lead or be one of the leaders of a mission going from India to China, carrying gifts to the Mongol ruler of China. It wasn't Kublai Khan. He was dead by then. It was one of his successors. So Ibn Battuta started out with this great convoy of servants and slaves and gift bearers and everything on the way to China. But the whole mission collapsed in southern India because the ships all sank in a storm. Unfortunately for Ibn Battuta, and I say that, I'll tell you why, he was still on shore. Well, he was on shore because he was trying to arrange accommodation for one of his concubines on the ship. But the ships all went down, and if he went back to Delhi, the Sultan would want to say, hey, you were one of the leaders of this expedition. Why didn't you go down with the ships too? So he decided, well, I can't go back there. So he decides to go somewhere else, and that is to the Maldive Islands, which are off the southwestern coast of India. Islands that may not be with us too much longer, owing to climate change and the rise of sea levels. They're atolls that lie very low in the water. You can see I've marked here in the middle of the map the Maldive Islands. He spent, we think, about 18 months mainly on this little atoll, and you see that the capital city of the Maldivian Republic is on this island of Mahal, takes up the whole island. Now there, Ibn Battuta met the queen of the Maldives and served as a judge for a number of months, because by this time the Maldive Islands had converted entirely to Islam. So he got this job as a judge, and we learn in his narrative quite a bit about it. In fact, I passed on some readings to Susan, which maybe some of you have now read, about Ibn Battuta taking part in a plot to overthrow the queen and rule the island by himself, well, and him and some other complicitors as well. It never came to anything, but it showed like what an adventurer he was, trying something like that. But anyway, he served as a judge for these months, and this is the judge on the guy on the left. And here's what he had to say about his relationships with women who pled cases before his court. One of the things he tried to do was this. He says their women folk do not cover their heads, not even on one side. Most of them wear only one apron from the navel to the ground, the rest of their bodies being uncovered. When I was Qadi, or chief judge, there, I tried to put an end to this practice and ordered them to wear clothes, but I met with no success. No woman was admitted to my presence in a lawsuit unless her body was covered, but apart from that, I was unable to effect anything. So it's quite clear that the women of the Maldives, though many of them pious Muslim women, were not going to give up their own traditions of dress just because the chief Qadi at the time said they should do it. The fifth motive that I think Ibn Battuta had for traveling was one that's kind of hard to explain, and that is places he went to just because they were there. In other words, he gives no explanation whatsoever for visiting certain places. This applies notably to his trip way down the East African coast as far as the town of Kilwa, a very important trading center in the 14th century, which is today in Tanzania, and it's south of the equator. So that was the one time that he crossed the equator. Stayed there not a very long time, and then headed north again. We don't know why. Maybe he was looking for a job, but didn't really want to live there, and so he left. We can see Kilwa here now down at the bottom of the map. I mentioned Ibn Battuta's cosmopolitanism, and one of the elements of that I think is especially intriguing is that traveling back and forth across Afrasia, he was always running into people he knew. Notice the map here. We're back to Tangier, and then the city over on the right is called Ceuta. It's actually still part of Spain, that little city. And it's about 40 or so miles between them, that's all. Excuse me, I had my timer on and it just went off. So notice the closeness of Ceuta and Tangier. But anyway, he finally made it to China, at least the southern coastal cities of China. And there he met a man whose name was al-Bushri. And this is what he has to say in the Rihla. When we conversed after our formal greetings, it occurred to me that I knew him. I looked at him for a long time. He said, "I see you looking at me as though you knew me." I said, "Which country are you from?" He said, "From Ceuta." I said, "I'm from Tangier." He greeted me again and wept, and I wept too. I said, "Have you been to India?" He said, "Yes, I have been to the capital, Delhi." When he said that to me, I remembered him and said, "Are you al-Bushri?" And he said, "Yes." Well, the story doesn't really end there, because Ibn Battuta, having met al-Bushri in Delhi and then meeting him again in China, a few years later, he met al-Bushri's brother in the caravan city of Sijil Masa on the northern edge of the Sahara Desert. And really what he had to say about that was, oh, how far apart they are. Well, Ibn Battuta had many, many adventures in his travels. Lost in a snowstorm, lost in the desert, shot in the shoulder, caught malaria, captured by bandits, shipwrecked, attacked by pirates, nearly executed by the Sultan of Delhi, met with 3 Mongol emperors involved in that plot that we mentioned, fought in an assault on an Indian port, barely escaped the Black Death, bought and sold slave women, got married and divorced at least 7 times, and he had several children. Now, if you are familiar with Marco Polo's travels and you read his account of his journey to China, you can see that Marco Polo is a kind of a stick man. He doesn't say very much about these kinds of personal experiences. Ibn Battuta's narrative seems to me to be much more alive. Now, part of this liveliness is the fact that he traveled during the twilight of the age of Mongol dominance, the great period when Mongol rulers controlled huge amounts of territory from China to the Middle East and Europe. When he was traveling, there were 4 large Mongol kingdoms that you see here on the map, the ones more toward the north in orange, red, green, and blue-green. So Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan, is long gone. He'd been dead for almost a century. But there were still these big kingdoms that were ruled by his descendants, his sons and his grandsons and his great-grandsons. There were also 2 very powerful states, one in Egypt, in brown there, ruled by Turkic military men, and then the Sultanate of Delhi over there in purple in India, which we've already mentioned. These are all pretty stable states in the middle 14th century, and that was good for Ibn Battuta because it was not a bad time to travel. It was reasonably stable politically, and that meant that merchants and any other travelers could move back and forth the hemisphere without too much difficulty. So he goes as far east as China, as we see, and then he comes back home pretty fast. It takes him just a couple of years to get back to Morocco. He goes back to Tangier. He visits the grave of his mother, who died while he was traveling. Then he decides to take another trip. One is a very short one across to Europe, to Granada, which was still a Muslim kingdom, and then he went south all the way across the Sahara Desert to the kingdom of Mali, and successfully back again. That trip took him across the Atlas Mountains of Morocco and then down through this river valley. We know he took this route down to this river valley of the Ziz River, and this river valley and the water just sort of peters out into the Sahara Desert. But at the end of the valley is this caravan city called Sijil Masa, and there he joined a caravan going across the desert to Mali and then back again. This time he decided to stay home. He went to the capital city of the kingdom. It was called the Marinid dynasty that ruled Morocco. And the ruler there heard about him and said, well, look, you've got to talk about your travels. We've heard where you've gone, and I'd like you to write something up about this. Well, when the Sultan asks you, or one should say commands you, to write about your travels, then you'd better well do it. So he had met a young literary scholar when he was in Granada, and somehow he connected with him, and together the two of them began the job of taking down Ibn Battuta's career. So we see here it's Ibn Juzay was his name, a young man on the left, and Ibn Battuta, I think, looking in this illustration fatter than he probably was. I don't know. But anyway, they started working together. Ibn Battuta was not a literary scholar. Obviously, he was literate, very literate, but he couldn't really, he didn't have the training for writing in a fancy, lucid way. So he dictated and jotted down things and handed them to Ibn Juzay, who then began to compile the travels. And we don't know how long they worked together, maybe a year or two. I think it's important to note right here that despite the extraordinary extent of his journeys, he's not really unique. And we get an idea of that already because of the people that he met along the way, including al-Bushri, who came from Morocco and had made his way all the way to China. The thing is that al-Bushri apparently didn't write a book about it. And there were lots of Muslims who were traveling very widely out to these new empires and kingdoms of Islam looking for jobs. Some of them stayed there the rest of their lives. Some of them went home again. But he wasn't alone in that. It was just that he wrote a book. And that's what you have to do if you want people to remember you, is write a book about yourself, an autobiography, which is what the Rihla is in most respects. Why is the book important? Well, it's just an extremely precious source of the world of the 14th century. And it conveys this clear idea of the cosmopolitanism of the Muslim world, which extended really all the way across the hemisphere at that time. One can say that Muslims probably had a greater, let's say educated Muslims, probably had a greater consciousness of Afro-Eurasia as a whole than any other educated group anywhere in Afro-Eurasia, anywhere in the world. And his description is marvelous because of all the many things that he talks about, and I'm not going to read these off, but I'm listing them here. Also, it's interesting to note, I want to, oh, that's good, okay. Oh yeah, these pictures over here on the right, I wanted to mention that they're pictures of what some artists think Ibn Battuta looked like or may have looked like. The fact is we have no idea whatsoever what he looked like, whether he was tall or short or fat or thin, although we do know that he had a beard, because at one point in the Rihla he mentions his beard. But now, why should we believe anything that he has to say? Now, you're all teachers, and or I think most of you are teachers, and you and I, we are trained to be skeptical of primary source documents. They could be fake, they could be a pack of lies. How do we know they aren't? Some factors to consider here. One is that the Rihla is not a diary or a journal, but it's a work of literature. There was a genre of literature really called the Rihla, and there were many books that they called Rihlas, which were always accounts of travels, particularly travels that involved a pilgrimage to Mecca. So it was all composed after he got home, but more than that, we have no evidence that he got home with any notes whatsoever. We know, in fact, he lost everything a couple of times during his travels. We have independent evidence, however, that he was a real person and one who traveled. We don't have much, but we have evidence from a few sources of scholars who lived at the same time he did, who mention him and mention him as a traveler and are in no way dependent in what they say on what he wrote. Also, many of the observations that he makes about places he goes are corroborated by independent evidence. For example, if he says that Ibn al-Walid was the governor of Aleppo in Syria when I was there, and he put me up in his house and he treated me generously and so on, well, we may have from chronicles and other sources that Ibn al-Walid was indeed the governor of Aleppo at that time. Also, this doesn't prove that his narrative is entirely reliable. He does reveal in great detail a good deal about his personal life, experiences, attitudes, opinions, something that Marco Polo hardly ever does. In that respect, Marco Polo is kind of a two-dimensional figure. Here's Ibn Battuta writing something about his personal life. I had with me a slave girl who was close to the time of her delivery, and I had intended to transport her to Samarkand so that she might have the child there. She gave birth to a child that same night. This infant girl was born under a lucky star, and I experienced everything to give me joy and satisfaction from the time of her birth. She died 2 months after my arrival in India. And there are other very personal, sometimes poignant stories about that. In the discussion period, if you want to talk more about his wives and slave girls and relations with women, I'll be happy to do that. Now, the Rihla presents really a lot of problems and puzzles, even though I say that it's clearly authentic, it's not a forgery, and it's not just a pack of lies, that most of the things that he talks about and the places he went and the people he saw probably really happened, but not necessarily all of them. For example, the itinerary is sometimes confused. You have places in the Rihla where he would say something by analogy like, I traveled from Boston to New York, and on the way I passed through Philadelphia. Huh? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But you've got to give him some slack here, because he had to remember pretty much everything that he did and saw, probably with help from some locals in Morocco, but he was bound to get some of that sort of thing wrong. The same with the chronology. Sometimes that doesn't make any sense. He says, for example, that he went from Mecca to Delhi in 1 year. But then you read the intervening chapters in the Rihla, and it becomes clear from the internal evidence there that it took 2 years to make that trip. So either when he left or when he arrived has got to be wrong. The author sometimes copies from other writers. Well, let me show you an example of that in a second. And he claims to have visited a few places he probably did not visit. For example, he copies a bit regarding Mecca and Damascus and some other places from another Rihla writer, Ibn Jubayr, who lived 2 centuries earlier. And they both visited Mosul in Iraq, which of course has been so terribly destroyed in the last few months. And I'll just let you notice, if you want to just read this for a second, the similarities in the 2 accounts are too close to overlook. On the other hand, to do that was not regarded as simple plagiarism. Ibn Battuta doesn't deserve an F because he quoted with Ibn Jubayr. Sometimes he actually attributes a quote to Ibn Jubayr. Sometimes he doesn't. But in those days, it was regarded as, you know, not so bad to do this kind of thing because you were quoting a guy who probably said it maybe better than you could, who wrote very clearly and lucidly, and who was well known. And it's okay to quote somebody like that, and if you forget to mention his name, well, everybody will know who he is anyway, at least educated people. He does that with a couple of other people as well, but he doesn't do it much as far as we know. He also claims that he took a trip to a place called Bulgar, which is on the Volga River, that star there, and it had a large community of Muslims that were quite well known that far north into what of course today is Russia. But the evidence from the Rihla, oh, there's my phone ringing, sorry. But the evidence from the Rihla really is not convincing at all. It's got a lot of problems with it. And most scholars don't think he really went there. So why does he say he did? Well, remember that his Rihla is not an account based on a diary. It's written later as a literary work. And maybe Ibn Juzay said to him, well, didn't you go to Bulgar? There's a really large Muslim community there. He said, well, no, I didn't get there, but I really wanted to. So Ibn Juzay says, well, you really ought to have that in the account, because what your account is a tour of the Muslim world of that time. So you really shouldn't leave that out. So they stuck it in. That's one explanation. Another may be that a copyist later on stuck it in there. So there are these problems, and they're really quite interesting to study, and some of them have certainly not been solved. By tradition, Ibn Battuta's tomb rests in the city of Tangier. I've been there a couple of times, but maybe it isn't, because there's no inscription on it, and there's some indirect evidence that he might have died someplace else, a town that was near the city of Casablanca. So we don't know if he's really there, but I like to think that he's buried underneath the building somewhere, and I cried when I visited there, and I prayed for his soul. So as I said in the beginning, Ibn Battuta has become much better known in Western countries. Over here on the left, we see a feature from a current world history textbook, a college, an AP text that's popular, writing about Ibn Battuta in the Mali Empire. There's been a sort of fantastic literature that's developed as well. Down at the bottom, Ibn Battuta in the Valley of Doom. This is a children's book, and there's nothing in the Rihla about a Valley of Doom. But, okay, so what? I think everybody should know this is a fantasy, but it's a good story. Then we have, at the bottom of this odd-looking image, Ibn Battuta's crater, the crater on the moon that's been named after him. And finally, over on the right, a very nice film, and Susan will supply that with the information of the bibliography of sources on Ibn Battuta. And you can actually find this on YouTube without any trouble. It's an IMAX production about the initial travel of Ibn Battuta from Tangier to Mecca. That's all it does, but it's really good. Back in the first decade of the new century, I consulted for a number of years on development of a feature-length movie about Ibn Battuta. And one of the participants was this guy. You may recognize him because he's been in a lot of movies as a character actor. He was born in France, but he's descended from Moroccan parents, Berbers, so you can see that by the Berber name. And he was going to play the part of Ibn Battuta, would play the part, will play the part if we can ever get this project underway. But it's been hard to do it just because of the money involved and getting the financing that we'd like to have. So I hope someday this film will appear, although I'd much prefer like a 20-episode series on TV. I think that would be a better way to do it. So that's it. Thank you very much, and we can have some time for discussion.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ross. Oh my goodness, so much there to take in and think about. I scribbled questions and notes all over my notes here, and I think we're eager to engage, and just want to start by thanking you so much for all that you shared. Let me remind participants that this is a good time to add any questions, burning questions that you have, or items of interest, things you'd like to pursue further with Ross. So you can just type those into the chat box at the bottom of the left-hand column, and push enter, and we'll see those as they come up. You can also raise your hand if you think you have a working microphone, and Stephanie can put you on live if you'd like to say hello to Ross and ask a question too. So go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to do that. Ross, it was wonderful to hear you explicate both the life and the text, the story of the text itself, and so many fascinating features about that. The questions about the similarities, the differences with Marco Polo's narrative was really fascinating to hear about. I was very touched by the naming of the crater after him. That was a surprise to me and kind of poetic. So we have a couple of questions to start off with. Angela Lee has asked a really great pair of questions here. I was wondering about this myself, but has any of your understanding about Ibn Battuta changed since you've written the book initially? And paired with that, are you seeing some new scholarship on his life and his narrative that is exciting or has potential to shift understandings in any important ways? We'd love to know what has transpired since you first began this work back in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Before I answer, should I switch on the video, Susan?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for remembering that. Yes, that would be terrific. If you push your video button, then we can see you, and that would be fun to see for the questions. Yep, I think you've got it turned on now.
Can you can see me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah, that's a good question. I think, in a broad sense, we don't know a whole lot more about him. Of course, there's been a lot of literature on the world of the 14th century since I wrote the first edition of the book. And when I did the second edition, I tried to incorporate some of that new literature just about the world that he lived and traveled in. The third edition, I didn't do much more. And, you know, editors, publishers like to do editions because if the book sells in classes in college, as mine does, they like to put out a new edition so that all the secondhand copies are swept off the shelves, and they start selling a new copy again. It's good for me too when they do that. But I think if I were to do another edition, or maybe in collaboration with someone, I'd have to really make quite a few changes in that general world. Nothing drastic, but nonetheless, the literature has really developed. Now, about Ibn Battuta himself, we don't know much of anything more, but we know a little bit. And this has been attributed to a well-known scholar in Morocco, and also made better known by a travel writer who's also an excellent Arabist named Tim McIntosh Smith. He lives in Yemen. Even now, he's still living in Yemen with all that warfare going on. And he wrote in, he did, I think you have that on the list, don't you, Susan? Tim McIntosh Smith's 3 volumes. It's a travel work.
I missed that one.
He follows the footsteps of Ibn Battuta, sort of, and writes a lot about himself, but also about Ibn Battuta. And there are a couple of interesting pieces of information that appeared. One of them is a letter that suggests that Ibn Battuta may have lived not in Tangier after he got home, but near Casablanca. It was a letter about buying some property. And the other is that there's some evidence now of his copying a manuscript in Damascus when he was there at the beginning of his travels. And because that manuscript is extant, and his name and you know, the date and place of his making this copy of this legal text is there for all to see. But you see, that's not very much, really, and there hasn't been. And I don't think we're going to uncover any great archives on Ibn Battuta. So his book, his own book, remains the major source of his life and career.
Interesting. Can I follow up with a question about the text as well? I'm wondering, to zoom way out and ask a question from 30,000 feet. Do you see a sort of an overriding ideological purpose or orientation of this narrative? Is it, I don't know if you would build on that idea of the tour of the Muslim world, but is there an element of pridefulness in that civilization, or beginning to define what the Islamic civilization and Islamic world was, or are there any arguments that he was engaging that were current at the time that might not make sense to us in such a different context? Sometimes a lot of the famous chronicles of the ancient world were for the glorification of a particular ruler, and I wonder if you see a kind of an underlying purpose, or is it just curiosity? People were curious and they wanted information. They were thirsty for information. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, that's another very good question. What you said about praising rulers, he has one place in the book where he lists what he thinks are the 7 greatest rulers ruling at that time. And I probably would not include the Marinid state in Morocco as one of them, but he has to because it's his own ruler. And so there's these long statements, pains, P-A-E-N-S, to the ruler of Morocco who commanded him to write the book. So there's plenty of that sort of thing. I think the main point here is he is not so much that he engaged in any sort of philosophical or historical or theological debate. He really doesn't do that at all. He has some encounters with both Christians and Jews. He doesn't say anything negative about them, except in one place where there was a Jew that he met, and he thought the Jew was given a seat nearer to the front of the room in an audience with the ruler than he thought this Jewish man should get. And that's the extent of it. So that's part of the cosmopolitanism of it. He just doesn't engage in sectarianism, sectarian debate. Although I have to say that the people that he tends not to like much at all to the extent of going around their villages, are Shiites.
Oh.
And that isn't because he hates them and wants to kill them and so on. It's just that he sees them as what he calls rafidi, or turncoats. That, they went off on this weird sect. And those people are weird, so I don't really want to have a whole lot to do with them.
Interesting.
And that's about the extent of that. But it's also clear, you have to read between the lines. But we know that he was an educated gentleman. He came home, he wrote his book, and the book was for other educated gentlemen, and maybe some gentlewomen too, I hope. Educated people, that's who it was for. And he clearly was trying to impress them, and we see that in a number of ways in the book where he does that. And the fact that he does it may reflect the fact that he knew he wasn't really some kind of great scholar. He knew that. And one of the people who wrote about him during his own time, a little biographical entry in a book by a very well-known scholar who lived in both Spain and Morocco, actually says that, well, Ibn Battuta, he's this guy, and he appears to have gone to India, and I think maybe we should believe him. But he didn't have what he said. He didn't have much of the Muslim sciences, meaning he wasn't much of a scholar. And in fact, one translator has translated that as Ibn Battuta did not have too much of what it takes. As a legal scholar or a jurist or whatever. So I think in a way there is some puffery in his book that is very deliberate, because he does want to impress people around him.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much for those reflections. Another really interesting request has come in from Catherine Rossignol. Thank you, Catherine, for writing. And Catherine is wondering if you can give us your sort of top hits of the Rihla, if there are certain passages or stories that you think teach particularly well for high school students, kind of some not missed sections or segments that we should be looking for, that we would love to know, love to have your guidance on what they might be. Of course, I suppose it depends on what you could teach. When you look at the long list of related ideas and topics that are touched on in the narrative, it does depend on what you're looking for. But there any off the top of your head that rise to the surface as being particularly student friendly, or that you have found to be favorite parts of your own freshman or sophomore students over the years at San Diego State?
Yeah, I know that the journey about which he's quoted the most in both college and high school textbooks is, and middle school textbooks too, because, well, for example, in California we teach that period in 7th grade, is the journey to Mali. And so students who are studying the Mali Empire can read very interesting things about the Mali state, the royal court ceremony, things that he talks about almost being eaten by a crocodile, and other adventures in Mali, and also the crossing back and forth across the Sahara Desert is a wonderful description of that. People dying along the way and getting bitten by scorpions and so on. But also his discussions of relations between men and women are particularly interesting in connection with Mali, because he finds the women in Mali are somewhat like the women in the Maldive Islands. He finds them shocking because they don't cover up properly. Like, I don't mean wearing burqas,
right.
wearing, modest head covering, and of course being dressed from the waist down rather than, I mean, excuse me, from the waist up rather than naked. So Mali's always a good one to use. The travels in India, where he stays a long time, don't get that much quoting, maybe because India isn't studied that much during this period in schools. But wow, I mean, his descriptions of what happened there are really amazing. The ruler for whom he worked as a judge was a very smart, very learned man, but he was also a horrible person as regards handing out punishment to people who, you know, might have done some minor thing. In fact, Ibn Battuta, and this is a wonderful passage to quote, he gets in trouble because, not because he did anything, but because he visits this guy who, a Sufi guy who is trying to stand up to the ruler and not do what he wants him to do. And he goes and visits him, and that makes him guilty by association. And so he's held in the palace, and he sits there for a couple of days, reciting the Quran over and over again, praying to God to deliver him. And finally, the Sultan lets him go, and later on brings him back into the state as an important person again. But there are things like that. I'm trying to think. The China trip is not so interesting, really. It's a bit hard to interpret, and some people don't think he went there at all.
We've just this moment had that question in the box, Sarah, when he asks, "What's your take on that question of whether he went to China or not?"
Yeah. Okay. Well, I should just go into that. Well, I had to think about this a lot. And in my book, I have a long footnote which argues that he may very well have, probably did visit the southern coast of China. But in the Rihla, he also claims to have gone to Beijing, which is anything but southern China, right? It's way in the north, and that was the Mongol capital. And he claims to have gone there and attended the funeral of the Mongol Khan or ruler, even though no Mongol ruler died at that time that we know of. And so it's very suspect. It's possible that a copyist later on, you see, this is a manuscript, right? And people could change it. And maybe it was changed and did a pretty good job of covering up that Ibn Battuta did not really go to China. But there's other aspects of it that make me think he did, at least to the southern coast. And this is still an interesting debate.
That's a great answer. Thank you. A good sort of parsing of of the evidence. Well, I think, Ross, if you will give me a moment here, I'll just run through a few of the resources that we wanted to share, and then perhaps we can have you come on again at the end and see if there's anything else you want to add. And feel free to jump in as I'm speaking. You know many of these much better than any of us do, but Russ was a great help in also in making these selections. So I wanted first to start off by sharing the link here to our primary source resource guide. We have guides, I should say. This is one of 60 or so topical resource guides for K through 12 teachers that we've created here at Primary Source. And the one that's featured here is on the Silk Roads, and Ibn Battuta and his life, and some of the books about him, including Ross's, are featured in this guide. These guides, we highlight the most helpful, relevant, student-friendly resources that are widely available to teachers, and there's a simple free registration process you can go through to access the full collection of guides. So I wanted to make sure that people knew about those. Next, I wanted to share the really rich resource that came out of the University of California, Berkeley, their regional studies program, Orias. And this is one of the best sites that you'll find that we highlight on our guide. It's really extensive. It places Ibn Battuta's narrative in the context of world history with readings, primary documents, interpretive mini essays, and lots of great illustrations. And I looked at the section on the Maldive Islands that you gave us to read, Ross, and there's some related video on the Maldive Islands today and the geographic and climate challenges, which relate to some of the features of the text. So it's very student usable, and students could sort through it and find interesting parts to read, and would make great, there's great potential, I think, there for reading from that. Next, PBS has done some good multimedia work on Ibn Battuta. This is for younger students. There's one of the affiliates of PBS did a World Explorers series, a mini-series, and highlights several famous explorers and adventurers, and Ibn Battuta is one of them. So this is a lovely 4-minute animated video, great camel shadow puppets. I loved it. So we have the link for you there. And then very exciting, connected to that same project, it's Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo and Zheng He, and they created with Google Earth tours of those 3 great travelers and their stories. So that is completely absorbing, and you can get lost in there, but there is just great. Students would have a great time looking at where Ibn Battuta traveled, and then that maps onto the modern day map, so you can see the city center of Tunis and where the modern day road system is and where his travels led him out of, and it's really great to explore. The next slide that we have to share is a slide of some books and films that were recommended by Ross, and yours being, of course, the lead here, and then another collection that focuses on the African, sub-Saharan African sections of his travels that has been published more recently. There's a lovely children's book for upper elementary that many of you probably know, Traveling Man, that is featured here. And then here is the film that Ross mentioned and highlighted. It's a 45-minute film narrated by Ben Kingsley. I forgot to put in the link. I'm sorry about that, but it is accessible online, and if you look up the title. And then a great tip for everyone is that the Smithsonian did a digital teacher's guide for the film, which is really, really nicely done and colorful and has great teaching activities to go along with the story. So that is a good one to keep an eye out for. And then finally, curriculum unit that comes out of the National Center for History in the Schools, which we mentioned before, is the organization that Ross has been spending his time, where he's been spending his time most recently. And this is the there's a lengthy, really in-depth curriculum unit, 70+ pages. There is a 6-page taster preview of that online, which I have linked there, and you can order the full unit if that is of interest to you. Well, that is a quick take on some of the resources.
Susan, I put in the chat down at the bottom there on the left, I put down that reference to Tim McIntosh Smith.
Oh, terrific! Thank you. Thanks. Yes, I missed that one. Yeah, we're glad to have that. Thanks. Did you push enter, because I'm not sure?
Oh, didn't I?
Looks like it maybe didn't come up there. We'll send it to people when we do.
There it is. There it is. Sorry.
Great. 3 volumes. Okay, good. So that's a great one to know about as well. So Ross, anything finally that you'd like to say about Panorama, about your textbook, what we might find in there, or about the pleasures of teaching about Ibn Battuta? Any final thoughts?
Oh, I think I will stop now. I was just glad to hear from Catherine on the chat, who would love to see a movie with Said Tagmawi as Ibn Battuta. So it's nice to know that some of you know Saeed Taghmaoui as a pretty well-known character actor.
That's great.
I think he would do a great job.
And I noticed that she proposes a Kickstarter campaign to crowdsource the funding. And I think Sotirios earlier said that this should really be a 10 or 20-part miniseries, which I think makes a great sense.
Yeah, that's what needs to be done.
That's what needs to be done.
Thank you.
Ross, we can't thank you enough. That was an absolute pleasure and treat to hear from you on this topic of such great importance to all of us, and clearly so much close to your heart, and something to which you've dedicated such effort and love and attention over the years. We thank you again for sharing with us tonight, and I want to thank as well the teachers who participated in our online seminar tonight. We hope that you'll stay in touch with us at Primary Source. Here are our social media connectors where you can find us, and our YouTube channel is among those as well. I want to wish you all a good rest of your month of November, and we will look forward to seeing you in December for the last of our 3-part series. Thank you, everybody, so much. Good night.
Good night.